The Security Weekly News is live on Tuesdays and Fridays at 12 o'clock Eastern Time most every week. I try to scan and produce a quick look at some major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Jason Wood, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you will look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Josh Goldberg about preparing, practicing, and presenting on security topics. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Little Kitty, and it's just about time for the news. But first, there's one announcement. Join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. This series of one-day, invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We're offering $100 off admission when you register with code SECWEEK23. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. And John, we have some cats visiting us, at least on my side, for today in the news. We have a lot of other news about stuff, a lot of which is not cat intelligence, which is pretty brilliant, but artificial intelligence. And I'm going to start off with just one real quick thing about DARPA announced a 2-year contest to their latest cyber AI challenge. And they're going to run it over 2 years in collaboration with DEF CON. And it's basically going to say, can an AI find and fix software flaws? And it's going to be, they listed off a bunch of languages that it will be related to: PHP, Ruby, Java. Also, half of them are going to be in the C and C++ area and memory safety. And for me, it's sort of like, I think it'll be kind of cool, but how much can we just still find problems in memory safety issues without, like, let's go into something else. But I don't want to monopolize the AI conversation here, because you had a lot of stuff as well. So tell us a little bit about what was coming across your radar.
We do. So I'm going to rip through 3 of these guys real quick. I think that one sounds sort of neat, the DARPA stuff. I'm going to keep an eye on that. I'm going to go in order of 3. So these are really sort of, maybe these guys are starting to think about the DARPA stuff. So first, Google announced last week idx.dev. You can put a HTTPS in front of that and you'll hit the website for it. And this is, they've basically taken Visual Studio Code, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes maybe, and they are adding their flavor of their LLMs into it for the phrase in the screen was just something about full stack coding with your AI. So they're really trying to figure out what can they do to bring into, not just so much in the coding window, but within the IDE in general, to sort of do generative coding and help folks either get up to speed better, work with their teams better, or write better code. So my big thing on these always is that going to help us write more secure code? So not so much find the issues like DARPA is working on, but when I'm first writing that code, is the code that I write going to be, maybe not need as much code reviews? Second one along that path, stability.ai. These are the folks that they did most of the initial funding for Stable Diffusion, which sort of kicked off this whole generative AI type thing. We were talking about some of those images in the last half, about where do we find our images for talks. Stable Diffusion is a good way. But so they have just open sourced something called StableCode, the quote unquote very first LLM generative AI product for coding. I think some other folks might have questions about that, but that's open sources out there on Hugging Face for folks who want to play with that model. So it's not directly in a product by itself. It's something more little. You got to get your hands dirty and get on. And my last for the 3 in this, Mike, which is an article over on Harvard Business Review. It's got a soft paywall. And I think that the headline of this interview sums it up for me quite nicely. AIs won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace humans without AI. And I think that's what a lot of us need to be thinking about right now. I'm not coding with these things. I'm not getting my hands, down at like that level of like, how can I use ChatGPT in my applications? But at the same time, I am trying to stay on top. Like I was just talking here now. It's like if I've got a development team, or I'm working with a dev team, and I can say, hey, why don't you guys go and use IDX dev or something else, and the code which comes out of that product, the resulting code becomes better, or it's faster, or less buggy, or maybe they come up with a more performant way of doing it. I think these tools are super useful for that. Am I going to go out to a ChatGPT in 2 or 3 years and say, create a startup for me which says blah, 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 that's probably not going to happen. But I think we can really leverage these tools to our benefit.
And I think, and I'll just bookend that with the idea of with one more article from Microsoft's Red Team. We covered Google's Red Team talking about AI back in episode 248. And the only thing that really stood out here was Microsoft's Red Team talking about how they do testing for such against generative AI, against these kind of chat services, and how they might produce harmful content for average users, for beneficial users. So it's not just how can we manipulate as a malicious user and manipulate the systems, that type of thing. How might this system just produce content that we don't want to put in front of the typical user, the normal user? So not necessarily something new there, but just a topic I wanted to reinforce. But I'm going to go from there, still talk about the government. So start off talking about DARPA and their cyber challenge. The White House and CISA wants to secure things. And they do have one of their areas of several, about 4 or 5 that they listed off is R&D and innovation, which does touch on AI and ML, and you covered just that in the summary of articles. But one of the other aspects I thought was neat is that this does talk about open source software foundations, and there is the memory safe languages, reduced Vuln classes, supply chain, all the common things that we've been talking about this year, getting a lot of attention. But there is also a education aspect in there. How do we do some developer education? And that, I think, is I'm going to pay attention to, because there is, as we talked about with Josh just in the last segment, how to present, how to educate and engage an audience. But we've also talked about, at least I've talked about, security awareness as, the last 20 years. If we've been doing the security awareness for the last 20 years and we still have insecure code, maybe our approach to security awareness isn't right. And, I don't want to make too great a stretch to say, it's just been top 10 lists or we're just repeating the same thing. There's a lot of complexity and nuance to this, but I really hope part of that education is the pedagogy. How do we actually engage developers, and what should we be educating them on, I think, is an area that appeals to me. So I don't know if I'm losing you there or if there's some other aspect of that. Help me out to understand whether I'm getting my point across, as Josh would hope I'm doing.
You're getting your point across. You practice ahead of time. I like it. So, yeah, this is an interesting one to me, and I keep trying to figure out how to crack it myself. One of the things my local Cloud Security Alliance chapters we're trying to do is actually reach out to the colleges and universities and high schools and get crowds involved there. The ISSA here is actually really good at that too. I showed up in an ISSA meeting, I think it was 2 months ago, and there was a bunch of kids from the local high school. And I thought that was just amazing that they were there and doing that. But I think, getting back to the talking about it part of it is how do you make it, you have to make it somewhat sexy. And I use that phrase a lot. I don't mean it in a type of sexualized way, but you have to make it interesting for folks. If you're going to go and talk about how you did something, there's always going to be someone who's interested in your talk. So if you wanted to do a talk about LaTeX and how you actually put your characters in there in the right place, there's someone out there for that. But if you're trying to encourage high schoolers or college kids to get more into AppSec or IoT security, all those type of things, you have to do it in a way which actually is interesting to them, right? It's either find a little chip and show them how to hack it, or how to break the robot, or how to build a robot, or how do you make it interesting for your target audience, which hopefully we got that point across in the last half. But let's sort of keep going. So one thing for our listeners, we're getting DOSed here right now after a week after Black Hat. We're going to be talking about Black Hat for a few weeks, but we're also putting a lot more articles into our show notes. So we're not going to cover everything here, but please do go and hit up the show notes, and you'll find a lot more great stuff in there. One I want to go to, we talked about Microsoft Mike really briefly. The guys over at SciCode released something called, they released a blog post talking about a proof of concept plugin which they made, which would allow once this plugin is installed in your VS Code. So if people don't know, Visual Studio Code is an IDE which it's a lighter. It's not related to Visual Studio. It's open source mostly. Takes plugins for whatever language you want to do or whatever tools you're using. These guys figured out that when they create that plugin, they're able to actually write code to not just get security tokens from other plugins. So like say I've got a plugin for, man, I don't want to pick on a vendor. I don't know, say there's a vendor out there doing static code analysis. You have to log into their cloud to get your license or to push code up there or whatever have you. These AI things pick up story, you get the idea. This malicious plugin can actually go and get the authentication codes from that other plugin. But the really fun part about all this is that malicious plugin can also get, so the way VS Code works is, I don't think you have to log in, but you pretty much, to get anything useful, you have to log into either GitHub or Microsoft accounts. And then that's how it syncs your stuff up to the cloud. So VS Code on my laptop looks like my desktop. Long story short, the guys figure out how to have that malicious plugin actually get your security tokens for GitHub or Microsoft. So that suddenly becomes a bad thing, right? And the posts gets to that point very quickly, but then sort of walks through how they actually got the plugin to do this and how you do an R&D on a plugin. So as usual, it's for the ones we like, it's sort of a neat write-up that talks through not just the ha, we got this, but here's how we did this, and allows people to learn and find that maybe sexy.
No, absolutely. It tells the story. Here's the hook. Here's the appeal to curiosity. You know, we got this token, or we did this something that hopefully gets that reader's attention, and then unfolds that journey to there. I'll also take another article about research that I added at the very last minute because I thought I'd added it before, but forgot. But this is Smashing the State Machine: The True Potential of Web Race Conditions. This is from James Kettle over at Portswigger, and it's a great research that is talking about web race conditions, time of check, time of use, some things that are maybe more familiar for those of you who've dealt with C-code land and mutexes and such things. And these problems can still exist within the web. And I've often thought of these, but I've put them into that mental category of these are business logic errors, because things like redeeming a gift card multiple times, or repeatedly applying a discount code, or having a sequence where you're supposed to go steps 1, 2, 3, 4, doing them out of order. What if you go steps 1, 4, 3, 2? What happens? And it's basically playing around with state machines, playing around with race conditions. And again, this is just a really great write-up that appeals to me for a couple reasons that I want to highlight from kind of a presentation perspective. It gives credit and talks about work that is built on in the past. So it talks about a timeless timing attack from a 2020 Usenix presentation. It talks about some other research that was done kind of similar to race condition, but it's really nice to see that this isn't, James Kettle just saying I'm the smartest person out there. It's more of, I chose to do a deep dive into a topic. I looked to see what other people have been doing in this area, saw that there were a lot of gaps, and just pulling it apart and writing about that journey. So it's the type of thing that's really neat to see how his focus changes. So I thought I'd use that as kind of the template, that if you are out there, listener, trying to figure out what kind of presentation to talk about, or what a topic you want to go after, doing a deep dive into something that maybe seems familiar, but has some gaps in it. People haven't talked about it a lot, or if they have, they haven't identified a particular angle on it. Those can be fruitful areas.
Yeah, it's that sounds. It sounds so. I don't know if I want to say simple or obvious, but just reordering the state of things. No pun intended. But usually you can't do that in an application, right? It's frequently hard for. If I'm trying to, I don't know, we talked about VS Code. It's usually, if I'm just being a user, it's hard for me to sort of modify the order that VS Code loads its plugins at startup or something like that. I'm trying to come up with an example here. But at the same time, when you're using something with a state machine, which for whatever reason you've got me thinking about step functions at Amazon, they've got, AWS has, the state machine as a service. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could see there being instances where, you can, you have a little more potential for control to get those states out of order. And then, okay, what happens once you've got that? So that's sort of an interesting thing to think about. Another one in here, which I know caught your eye, Shamir secret sharing. So I heard about this from a really good friend, Bill. He pasted this into me earlier a week or so ago, and it's just sort of it's a blog post by the previous co-founder and CTO of PayPal, and it gets off to a slow start, and I'm like, okay, it's sort of mathy, and we all know me, Matthew makes me almost tune out, but okay, share this, let me go and read it. And what it is, it's a story about when he was, very into, I'll say, cryptography when he was younger, and has a story in here about getting into Bruce Snyder's living room at a party and like looking through all his crypto books. But all that accumulated when he was at PayPal, he wanted to improve the security of not just having a security key for the encryption on the PayPal database. And he figured out, hey, Shamir secret sharing, easy for me to say, has this the ability to have like a secret shared across X people, so no one single person has that secret. Sort of like the from the movies, turning the two keys in when you're launching your nukes. So they went ahead, they implemented this, they scheduled downtime, they re-encrypted the database, and they went to bring things back up, and it didn't work. So sort of, that's the core story behind this. And it's like, okay, well, why? And I don't know if I want to give it away, but there was I'll leave it there for an example for our listeners to think about, like, why would the password suddenly not work? Everyone entered their password right. They're trying it multiple times and they wouldn't accept their passwords. But the result is they figured out there was something wrong with how they had tested things. I'll say they had done R&D on Linux, but the actual prod server was running Solaris, probably Solaris 8 at the time, maybe 7. But yeah, the mismatch between those two things meant that something wasn't right and wasn't decrypting. And it always test in prod.
Always test in prod. So I'll preserve that avoidance of spoilers. But what I did want to do is I will hint and draw that back to an intro I did a couple weeks ago about the anniversary of Windows NT and the landman hash and the way password storage was handled in landman systems in Windows NT. Is actually somewhat related to this. So this is not that you were describing these Unix systems that had a particular error that introduced this bug, or had this, perhaps even not a bug, this unexpected behavior. So we'll let our listeners dive into that, and we'll see what kind of responses we get in between if people enjoyed that mystery. There was another one. I will say too, the spirit of presentations and hooks, curiosity. One of the things I loved about that article about the Samir secret sharing is he talks about being a sci-fi geek, and he mentioned Stanislaw Lem, who was a Polish sci-fi author, and I love a bunch of his books. And one of Stanislaw Lem's books is called The 1 Human Minute. And as a very random aside, one of the reasons I like that is that in 1 Human Minute, it's from 1983, I believe. So our theme this week is 1983. But it had this sentence about, meanwhile, computer crime has moved from fantasy into reality. A bank can indeed be robbed by remote control with electronic impulses that break or fool security codes, much as a safecracker uses a skeleton key, crowbar, or carborundum saw. And I just thought that was a fun thing to read about infosec. What does computer security sound like in early 1980s, and
life imitates
possibly not
art.
Too different from today. Yes. So let's see, what other things should we imitate here, John? You've got a bunch of other stuff. So we should mention a little bit maybe of DEF CON and Black Hat. As you mentioned, we'll go a deep dive in the next 2 weeks. But there was one about head in the sky, so to speak, at DEF CON that you were enjoying. Is this the satellite
Thank
CTO?
You. I almost missed that toss. So this was an interesting one. It brings together my everyone in here knows I've got the thing for the space security stuff recently. I'm also a bit of a political nerd. I keep that off the show, but so Politico is one of the things that ends up frequently in my Google newsfeed. And this time, Politico had an article talking about, for quote unquote, for the first time, U.S. government lets hackers break into satellite in space. And really what's going on is the CTF at DEF CON they had a satellite up there, and they're like, this was actually the U.S. Air Force and Space Force. I still think that should be in a movie and not real life. But anyways, these folks decided to let's give people permission to point at a satellite and see what could happen. And again, that always to me says, like, what, you think they're not trying anyways? But it's neat to see, and this is, how will I say, this had a wide enough sphere of a cast of this news article and how they probably put PR behind this, that I was hearing people last week who don't usually talk to me about security go, "Oh, did you hear about the U.S. government letting people hack a satellite?" I'm like, "Oh, cool. So this is getting out." And I think that's interesting from the point of view of, we've talked about this a few times here recently. There was an article or a white paper written by some folks in Germany, I believe, talking about what they were doing around this type of space. But for me, it's right back to what we were talking about, Mike, 2 or 3 articles ago, of how do you get people interested in this? How do you get people in high school or college, whatever else? And this is a pretty great way of how they obviously got, probably aiming towards the political types, but also general public. I'm sure this must be in USA Today or somewhere else where people are talking about it to me, but like, that I think that's great. That's what we want people to think about. Okay, well, can you do this? Who can do this? It's a little bit sort of in a way of like a large scale general public threat modeling of like what happens if you hack the satellite. And I think that's the conversation I had with someone, and I remember it. They're like saying, "Well, why would you want to do that? What would you do if you could capture a satellite?" I'm like, "Well, you could just DOS it. I mean, that's the basic thing. Or could you modify data going through it? Could you have it, that I think that's the fun part of like, it turned into a threat modeling experiment without even me prompting it at all. They're just like, well, why would you want to do that? And I thought that was sort of cool.
Yeah, and all kinds of fun stuff. You can crash it into other satellites. You can, do all sorts of fun things. But these are the areas of I'm going into movie land with my threat modeling, I will admit. But there's coming back to, perhaps let's ground us back into the real world. There is yet more CPU, and now attack here, the downfall. Now, we mentioned another CPU attack last week, I think, and we sort of just hopped over it real quick. But it feels like, can we keep jumping over all these CPU attacks or not? And here in this case, this is the downfall bug, and it is essentially called using a gather technique, or to basically leak data out of a Linux kernel from user space. So now user space program can go and, as demonstrated, pull out some encryption keys, some AES keys, and things like that. So these are demonstrably pretty impactful things that threat models are going to have to be updated on, because the author in the white paper says that previously there were some scenarios and security vulns, bugs that didn't seem exploitable or only seemed like a DOS, meaning their CVSS score might be low, or yes, they should be fixed, but there's not there's less potential consequences around it. Now saying, well, because of this downfall, we have to go and revisit those types of threat models and look at them and say, well, maybe this actually could be used to leak some of the sensitive data on a shared computing resource. So clearly the cloud this is something for cloud providers to be worried about, shared computing, multi-tenant areas.
Yeah. It's funny. This originally was in your list of stories. Like, I saw about it and I'm like, that's another one. I didn't even bother to add it to your queue, man.
I was trying to resist.
And that's just so horrible, but that's the state of the last month. And obviously part of this is we're gearing up for Black Hat, and these things have come out. There was I hang out on the CNCF Tag Security Slack, and like we've had like one of these articles posted for I think for like 3 or 4 weeks in a row now. So thank you for going over the details on that. What caught my attention on the backside of this is, okay, well, there's a new vulnerability. How do we patch this one? Intel has added code. Again, we see this because it's open source. One of the good things about open source, so the code has to go out to the Linux kernel tree, and we get to see like what the microcode looks like for the patch. And the fine folks over at Phronix, who I've been quoting their stuff a lot recently. They do a really good blog on Linux kernel stuff, and Linux in general. But they did some research on this patch, and they're seeing that it can it can cause up to 39% overhead on your CPU. That's we're now talking measurable amounts, right? Like 2-3-5%, I might be like, yeah, no problem. But imagine if you've got 1,000 CPUs at Amazon, which is not out of the question, and you've just lost 39% of your performance. So you now have to have what, 1,500 basically, 1,400. That's that hits you in the pocketbook. So people will be looking for other ways to get around this. I mean, I can think of one, right? Well, let's just talk it through. One way you could, at that point, if you have 1,000 machines at Amazon, you're probably at the point where it would make sense to go and actually rent out the bare metal versions and then do your own virtualization or your own VMs on top. So that'd probably be a way cheaper way of doing this than adding an extra 300 VMs, as much as Amazon wouldn't like me to say that. But yeah, how do you, once you've got a mitigation, we always think about the mitigation from what that costs us to, reboot the kernel or to patch it or all that type of thing. But here you've got a really clean example of how much is that going to cost your department or your company. So lots of angles to these type of things to think about.
Yeah, and I like that hook into the business aspect. How do we, what's the budget? How do we think about the cost of security? And it's quite stark there. I'm going to take us the opposite end of that spectrum, perhaps. And we had a pair of just kind of small bugs, I want to say, that are, that are not as grand as AI and red teaming AI or, the fun of smear, the secret sharing. But there's a Python parsing error in URLs, which perhaps is not surprising because URLs are messy. And I'm trying to think of the quote from Gandalf. They are quick to anger, something in quick to anger. Help me out, listeners. Fill in the rest of that quote. This is how we make people curious. But this caught your eye, and I'm curious if there was, valid input validation. We actually rarely talk about such things. Is that why this grabbed you, or was there another angle?
It grabbed me first because it was Python. I can't find the article on my there it is. Yeah, at first just Python is it's obviously started getting more attention over the last few years, mostly due to AI and ML. It's easy to use. It's fairly performant. If you do, Python seems to be getting back in the news again. I'm not quite sure why, but I think people are rediscovering that there's ways to make Python move faster. It had landed on my radar recently that core Python is still single-threaded. So if you want to do high-performance multi-threaded stuff, you got to start either standing on one leg, or there's some people out there working on a way around that.
That global lock can mess people up. Yes.
But in this case, yeah, the Python article hit, and I caught my attention. That's why it doesn't look like the Python site, so I'm not noticing the tab. But yeah, so URL split and URL parse are not doing validation of input. Mike, you're right. We don't talk about this very much nowadays because I think it's so assumed by many of us that do your input validation. That's and I guess maybe when the guys who wrote this library, I don't know, I'm guessing they were presuming that, or they had the point of view of, we expect that URL to be validated before it gets handed to the library. And that's not necessarily a bad assumption. I would hope that's in the documentation. I haven't looked at this too closely, honestly, so I'm not sure if it is. But yeah, right. This is a very, nowadays, probably when it came out, it wasn't that core of a part of Python. But now this is how much of what we're doing when, particularly in a language think about where you use Python. You want to do that sort of Swiss Army knife, Perlish type stuff. Sorry if I just trigger anyone. But that type of thing where it's I just want to grab this thing, crunchy, and throw it over here. Good chunk of the time, that thing you're going to grab is going to be from a URL, right? Could be a file URL or, an actual HTTP or what have you. So if now suddenly this has become a very core part of what people are doing, that could be a bit of a problem. So I thought it was interesting from that point of view. And it looks like it's documented as part of the Python stuff. So maybe this is, but anyways, I'm looking too closely at stuff. Interesting. Probably affects many of us who are working with Python. In time to go and update your things once again.
Indeed. Because those URLs, to fill in the full quote, they're subtle and quick to anger. Because there is not, part of the problem is there is ambiguity, if I can speak, ambiguity in what constitutes a good URL versus a bad URL. So in here, I'm not even talking about the anti-pattern of trying to educate users on, catch the phishing link. I'm just saying, how is a URL formed? And the article you linked to does mention RFC 3986. But what's fun here is that, what happens if there's a blank character that this URL starts with? And there's a lot of fun edge cases, weird cases about how schemes work, host names work. We've seen people be surprised what the authority section is and how that is used to visually trick people about what is the domain, where is this going to. We heard that pop up again when people are talking about the .zip, the .move TLDs that were just came into the that were released over the summer. But again, I think it's just I'm glad you brought that in just as a reminder of, yeah, there are still the small things that we have to remember, because one of the the small things was for me was this badge of shame from Bishop Fox, which was talking about some encryption issues in this badge reader, which can also be a fun threat modeling exercise in the sense of you've got a badge reader, you've got perhaps a way to bypass it, get the encryption keys, but perhaps you also have other physical security around this, or you have cameras. So this is the type of thing that maybe will be attacked once, but you have to, what does an attack look like? And that can be a fun, again, movie style threat modeling. But the only takeaway I wanted to really highlight from this is that as the part of the write-up, it says you can extract a key because it was what was intended to be a one-time insecure setup step just remained that install mode was persistent. So it's sort of like it was essentially default insecure. You had to set up, and to make the correlation or the comparison to OpenSSH or to SSH, you have to do a trust on first use as you set that up. And here's how that can break down if that first use becomes persistent use. So it's a fun article from that perspective. Neat research, and also just trying to pull in something in area, a topic or an area of AppSec we don't dive into too often.
It's funny. That particular phrase you're just using for first use, a lot of us would also look at that as, how many times have we made fun or, highlighted something which had a default root or something like that. And it's sort of the same thing. So where this is interesting to me, I saw it, but I'm glad you added it. Where's that phrase up top? What is called? Just lost it. Open supervised device protocol. So these are frequently, as we mentioned, it could be card readers. My understanding is also used in the military for cameras and stuff like that. So these should be hardened devices, right? And here's a list of 5 vulnerabilities from Bishop Fox. And I thought, well, at one time we sort of I hand waved it off like a lot of things last week. I didn't put it in, but it's things which. It feels a little bit like what we're seeing here on some of these stories is, I don't want to throw people under the bus, but some folks are missing some of the basics, right? We were talking about no input validation, same thing like this, sort of basic errors, downgrade attacks we've known about for years now from SSL and TLS. The install mode attack, I shouldn't be laughing, but that sort of gets the point there. Weak keys. I mean, a lot of these type of things which we're seeing are things which we've known about for a while. So why haven't these things been updated? At least that's sort of where my mind goes on this one.
Yeah, and even the very first item from this, the Vuln that they list, encryption is optional. Yeah. That to me brings the idea of the other articles we've been talking about in the sense of secure by default, secure by design. And that encryption being optional, it seems neither secure by design nor by default, as well as that trust on first use doesn't seem secure by default either. So I think some lessons
they're focusing too much on ease of use.
The ease of use. And I don't have a great ease of use segue to take us out here, John, but unless you've got something you can think of right off the top of your head.
Let's see. We've killed off the downfall. Lots more black hat stuff to come. Yeah, I think I've exhausted my abilities for 1 week.
We've exhausted our abilities. So in the spirit of giving a presentation, we'll also know when to end. So thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to us. Please do check out our conversation with Josh. We went a little long, but I thought it was really fun. And a lot of stuff in there that, honestly, we can keep the conversation going. So as we consider how to keep that conversation going, please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of things in the sky, check out Sunlight by Vandal Moon. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.